Right. So imagine this. You build a massive, globe-spanning empire almost entirely through frontline combat and relentless holy war. You're out there in the mud and the blood. And then, a few generations later, your descendants completely lock themselves inside a palace and literally never draw a sword again? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unravel this massive historical mystery. How exactly did the Ottoman Empire evolve from a rugged, frontier warrior state into a desk-bound, bureaucratic superpower?
It's a pretty bizarre historical paradox when you stop and think about it. You have to wonder, why did the fiercest warrior kings on earth voluntarily isolate themselves behind the towering walls of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul? Why on earth did the Ottoman sultans just stop leading their own armies?
To really wrap our heads around this shift, we need to look at the sheer contrast in how these guys lived. The early Ottoman rulers, who were known as Ghazis, essentially earned their crowns on the battlefield. They were fighting shoulder to shoulder with their troops, and their royal legitimacy came directly from those military victories. But jump forward a few centuries, and we see a total 180. We get these sedentary sovereigns. These later rulers were completely shielded from the public eye. They were running this vast empire, not by swinging a sword, but through written decrees and professional intermediaries.
Now, history absolutely loves to paint these later sultans as, well, just lazy or decadent. But modern historians see it completely differently. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't civilizational decay at all. It was more like the ultimate corporate restructuring. The retreat of the Sultan from the battlefield was actually a deliberate structural adaptation. They had to adapt, because running a massively institutionalized state requires a totally different skill set than leading a cavalry charge.
Just to put the scale of this into perspective, at its peak under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire spanned nearly 1 million square miles across 3 different continents. That is huge. And because the administration was so highly centralized, every single military campaign had to be launched directly from the capital in Istanbul. Imagine the crushing logistical nightmare of trying to march an army from Istanbul all the way to the frontiers of Central Europe or Persia.
That massive geography created what historians call a radius of action limit. Campaigns were completely at the mercy of the seasons. You know, the army couldn't even start marching until the spring rains dried up and there was enough pasture grass growing to feed thousands of transport animals. Those animals had to drag incredibly heavy artillery, and if you didn't wrap up the fighting before the winter mud set in, you were doomed. Distant campaigns led by the Sultan became impossibly expensive and grueling. It was, for sure, the world's worst road trip.
So, how do you solve a geographical crisis like that?
Well, the Ottomans essentially invented modern military delegation. They created this new supreme rank, the Serdar Ekrem, which translates to Commander-in-Chief. So instead of the Sultan dragging his entire astronomically expensive imperial entourage out to some distant, muddy border, they just professionalized their military command. They handed frontline authority over to highly capable ministers and grand viziers.
And the thing is, this delegation really worked. Take the 1585 Battle of Alvar during the Ottoman-Safavid War. You had Özdemiroglu Osman Pasha acting as Serdar Ekrem. With the Sultan safely back home and nowhere near the danger, Osman Pasha completely dismantled an Iranian ambush. He crushed the Safavid forces and even captured the city of Tabriz. This professional military command was a real game changer.
But you know, muddy roads and logistics were really only half the problem. The true danger was much closer to home. We've got to talk about dynastic succession. Originally, the Ottoman system was brutally, almost terrifyingly efficient. Young princes were sent out to govern provinces called sanjaks. Out there, they got rigorous military training and raised their own regional armies. Then, when the Sultan died, these brothers essentially fought a bloody survival of the fittest civil war to claim the throne.
To put an end to that traumatizing fratricide, the empire shifted gears to a system of agnatic seniority. Basically, the oldest male relative inherits the throne. But it came with a massive psychological cost, a system called the kafes, or the golden cage. Princes were no longer sent out to the provinces. Instead, they were permanently locked up within the Imperial Palace. Yeah, it stopped the civil wars, but it produced isolated heirs who had literally never seen the outside world. They were politically naive and, crucially, had absolutely zero military training.
So with the princes permanently confined to the palace, the entire center of political gravity shifted. The imperial harem moved permanently into Topkapi Palace, heavily centralizing domestic power. The battlefield just moved indoors. The private household of the Sultan became a massive political institution all on its own.
the Valide Sultans, the Queen Mothers, and various palace factions became incredibly influential in running the day-to-day affairs of the whole empire. And if you want to see just how much strategic influence the harem wielded, check out this wild piece of data. A sultan who had a European mother was 70% less likely to launch a military campaign into the West. Think about that for a second. 70%. The matrilineal background of the ruler was literally dictating the geopolitics of the entire Ottoman war machine.
Which brings us to a massive, deeply ironic revelation. Leaving Istanbul actually became a death sentence for a sultan. See, the Sultan's own elite guards, the famous Janissaries, had evolved from these hardcore frontier warriors into a really powerful, entrenched urban political class. They loved their municipal privileges. If a sultan packed up and left for a multi-year military campaign, the palace factions lost their direct access to power. Even worse, the Janissaries would routinely use the sultan's absence to launch a coup d'etat. So the very troops meant to protect the sultan became the #1 reason he couldn't even leave his own house.
And I want to be clear, this wasn't just some theoretical danger. Just look at the deeply tragic case of the young Sultan Osman II in 1622. He actually tried to bypass this corrupt Janissary establishment by personally leading a campaign up to Poland. His open plan was to raise a brand new, disciplined army while he was out there. Well, the Janissaries found out, and they responded by sparking a massive rebellion right in Istanbul. They captured the young sultan and brutally murdered him. It was a terrifying, crystal-clear message to every future ruler: stay in the capital.
But you know how history goes. There's always someone who tries to turn back the clock. Late in the 17th century, right in the middle of the devastating Great Turkish War, Sultan Mustafa II decided to completely ignore this bloody recent history. He was absolutely determined to restore the military glory of his ancestors, and he made the fateful, incredibly risky decision to personally lead his army into Europe against the Holy League.
He even issued this sweeping, dramatic decree that truly captures the high stakes of his ambition. He basically proclaimed, "I will not remain in the capital and consume the state's resources while the empire's borders are collapsing." It's a bold, incredibly romantic attempt to restore the old warrior king tradition. But, as we'll see, it was completely doomed from the start.
The climax of this whole doomed campaign went down on September 11, 1697, near a place called Zenta. Mustafa II's army was right in the middle of crossing the river Tisza. Now, being caught mid-river crossing is pretty much a literal tactical nightmare for any army. They were completely strung out and entirely unaware that the Imperial Habsburg army, commanded by the brilliant Prince Eugene of Savoy, had been quietly guided through the surrounding swamps right up to their rear.
The resulting Battle of Zenta was an unmitigated disaster for the Ottomans. The numbers here are just absolutely brutal. The Holy League sustained minimal losses. We're talking under 500 men killed. But the Ottomans, they suffered up to 30,000 casualties in a single day, with thousands drowning in the river in sheer panic. The Grand Vizier was killed, the entire imperial treasury was captured, and most shockingly, the enemy actually captured the seal of the empire. It was an unprecedented humiliation. There was simply no coming back from that.
This catastrophic defeat directly forced the Ottomans to sign the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, where they had to cede massive territories like Hungary and Transylvania. Back home, it sparked a massive rebellion known as the Edirne Event, which directly led to Sultan Mustafa II being deposed. The disaster at Zenta basically proved once and for all that a sultan's physical presence on the battlefield was a massive strategic liability. After this, the era of the campaigning Ottoman sultan was permanently dead and buried.
But here's the fascinating twist. Ultimately, what looks like a cowardly retreat into the palace was actually a triumph of bureaucracy. To survive in a changing world, the empire successfully stabilized itself by fully embracing a bureaucratic monarchy. They dismantled the old, unstable patrimonial military system, empowered a centralized state, and learned to rely entirely on specialized professional military commanders. The Sultan transitioned into a sacral sedentary figurehead who ensured domestic stability in the capital, while the Serdar Ekrem handled the actual business of war on the frontiers. Fast forward to the bitter end in the early 20th century, and that disconnect between the ruler and the battlefield was absolute. The final Sultan, Mehmet VI, was a direct product of the Kafes system. He had spent his entire life before taking the throne locked away in the harem. He had zero military connection and virtually no real executive influence. In 1922, as the empire finally dissolved, he quietly fled Istanbul on a British warship.
The story of the Ottoman sultans really challenges our basic definitions of what leadership actually means. They traded the sword for the pen, and in doing so, they managed to keep a sprawling, impossibly complex empire alive for centuries longer than it might have otherwise survived. So I want to leave you with this question to reflect on. Is a leader's true power found standing out there on the front lines, or is it actually found in the quiet, bureaucratic systems they built to outlast them? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.